In a quiet town where the gentle murmur of a river echoed through narrow, winding streets, and ancient oak trees bore silent witness to decades of human triumph and sorrow, there once existed a bond that was said to be unbreakable, a bond between a father and his son. Their story began in the tender days of childhood, when the world was a canvas painted with dreams and endless possibilities, and the love between them shone as bright as the morning sun. I remember the days when the father, whom everyone called Jonathan, was the epitome of strength and compassion. He would lift his little son, Ethan, onto his shoulders and march with him through the cobblestone alleys of their town, regaling him with tales of valor and mystery. Every whispered secret, every smile shared between them, was a promise of a future woven together with hope and unwavering trust. But as the years passed, the tapestry of their lives began to fray at the edges. Life, with its relentless passage of time, introduced challenges and hardships that no storybook could ever prepare them for. Jonathan, burdened by the weight of unfulfilled dreams and personal losses that haunted his every step, slowly transformed into a man consumed by bitterness. His eyes, once filled with the warmth of endless love, began to mirror the dark, turbulent storms that raged in his soul. And Ethan, who had grown up clutching onto the comforting image of his father as his guiding light, began to see the subtle fissures in the foundation of their bond. A love that, though once pure and unblemished, had gradually curdled into something unrecognizable. The unraveling began on an autumn day when the wind carried with it the scent of damp leaves and forgotten promises. It was a day that seemed to whisper of change, a day when fate, with its cruel sense of irony, set into motion events that would forever alter the course of their lives. Jonathan's once gentle hands became harsh and distant, as if weighed down by secrets too heavy to share. His words, once full of encouragement, turned sharp and biting. And every evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and cast long, sorrowful shadows on the walls of their modest home, Ethan's heart would ache with the loss of the father he once adored. I recall one such evening vividly, a time when the golden hues of dusk faded into the cool blues of approaching night, and the silence in the house was so profound that it seemed to scream. Ethan, now a young man on the precipice of understanding the harsh realities of life, sat alone at the worn wooden table. The faded photographs that adorned the mantel, a testament to a bygone era of laughter and shared dreams, seemed to mock him with their ghostly reminiscences of happier times. His mind raced with questions that had no answers. Where had the father he knew gone? What had led to the slow decay of love into a chasm of resentment? And in that quiet despair, he began to realize that sometimes the very people who are meant to be our shelter can become the architects of our deepest wounds. The seeds of discontent had been sown long before that fateful evening. Over the years, a series of misunderstandings, unspoken grievances, and unmet expectations had accumulated like fallen leaves in the dark recesses of their shared history. Jonathan, who had once sacrificed everything for the well-being of his son, now found himself crippled by the ghost of his own regrets. The dreams he once held dear, the aspirations of a life filled with purpose and joy, had been replaced by a relentless pursuit of what he felt was lost. And though Ethan had tried, time and again, to bridge the widening gap between them with words of compassion and gestures of forgiveness, the gulf only deepened. It was as if an invisible barrier had taken root in the space between them, a barrier constructed of silent accusations and mutual disappointments. Their once shared moments of tenderness became rare and fleeting, replaced by long, heavy silences and bitter exchanges that left both hearts bruised. Jonathan's anger, once a dormant ember, was fanned into a roaring blaze by the pressures of life, the unyielding demands of a world that showed no mercy for vulnerability. And Ethan, torn between the love that still lingered in the recesses of his memory and the sting of betrayal that marred every interaction, found himself trapped in a labyrinth of conflicting emotions. As the seasons cycled and the years turned like pages in a book too painful to read, The love that had once bound them began to twist into something unrecognizable, a form of hatred that was both quiet and consuming. There were nights when Ethan would lie awake in his room, the silence broken only by the soft ticking of the old clock on the wall, each tick a reminder of time slipping away and of moments lost forever. In those moments, he questioned whether the man he had once idolized was still there beneath the hardened exterior, or if he had been swallowed whole by the unforgiving tides of life. One bitter winter, when the cold seemed to seep into the very marrow of one's bones, an incident occurred that marked the final, irrevocable rupture between them. It happened on a night when the wind howled like a living creature outside, its mournful cry echoing through the empty halls of their home. Jonathan had been away all day, and Ethan, tired from a long journey to the city for work, returned home expecting a quiet night. Instead, he was met with a scene that shattered the remnants of his hope. A room filled with the bitter stench of anger and despair, where harsh words have been exchanged like weapons, leaving scars too deep to mend. Jonathan's voice, once a comforting melody, had turned into a symphony of rage and recrimination. In the heat of that fateful confrontation, old wounds were flung open, accusations were hurled with reckless abandon, and the fragile thread that had bound their hearts was severed in an instant. In the aftermath of that night, the home that had once been a sanctuary of shared dreams became a battlefield where every word was a battle cry and every silence a void that could never be filled. Ethan, with his heart torn asunder, felt a growing emptiness where love used to reside, a void that echoed with the painful realization that sometimes the bonds of blood are not enough to overcome the scars of unspoken pain. Jonathan, consumed by his own demons, retreated further into a world of anger and isolation, his soul hardened by the relentless march of disappointment and regret. And though deep within, both father and son longed for the healing balm of forgiveness and the comfort of reconciliation, the path to mending their broken bond seemed shrouded in an impenetrable fog of resentment. As the years unfolded like a tragic play, the distance between them widened, a chasm filled with memories of happier times and the bitter taste of what had been lost. Ethan's life became a series of fleeting moments of despair interwoven with desperate attempts to recapture the love that had once given him strength. He tried to understand his father's actions, seeking solace in the belief that beneath the hardened exterior there still lingered a man who had once been capable of great tenderness. But each time he reached out, he was met with cold indifference and walls built high from years of accumulated hurt. The silent dinners, the missed birthdays, the unreturned calls, all were stark reminders of a love that had decayed into a relationship marked by deep-seated animosity. There were moments, however, when the specter of what once was would break through the impenetrable veil of hostility. A fleeting smile, a half-remembered word of kindness, or a shared glance that spoke of unacknowledged pain. In those rare, fleeting instants, both father and son would be transported back to a time when love was pure and unburdened by the weight of unspoken grievances. For a brief moment, they could almost imagine that the chasm between them was but a shadow, something that could be overcome with time and compassion. But those moments were always transient, swallowed up once more by the overwhelming tide of bitterness that had come to define their every interaction. The town, too, seemed to sense the tragedy that unfolded behind closed doors. Whispers of the broken bond between Jonathan and Ethan drifted on the wind, carrying with them the sorrow of father and son who had once been inseparable. Neighbors would exchange sympathetic glances, their eyes filled with a quiet understanding of the silent battles that raged within the confines of every family. In a world that often celebrated the ideal of unyielding love and familial unity, the story of Jonathan and Ethan served as a painful reminder that sometimes the very foundations of our lives can crumble under the weight of unresolved grief and unmet expectations. Time, as it is wont to do, marched on with relentless determination. Ethan, now grown and bearing the scars of a lifetime of inner conflict, ventured out into the wider world in search of his own identity. He found solace in art, in the melodies of a piano that seemed to echo the sorrow in his heart, and in the written word that allowed him to pour his anguish onto paper. His work, raw and unfiltered, spoke of the pain of a love lost, of dreams shattered by the harsh realities of life. Yet, amid the expressions of his torment, there was also a glimmer of hope, a hope that, one day, the wounds might heal and the remnants of a once unbreakable bond could be mended. Jonathan, for his part, became a ghost in the house he once filled with laughter and light. The world around him faded into a blur of regret and isolation as he struggled to come to terms with the choices he had made and the irreversible damage they had wrought. In the quiet solitude of his study, surrounded by mementos of a past that was now just a series of half-remembered moments, he would often find himself lost in thought, haunted by the echoes of a time when he had been a father who inspired and nurtured. The burden of his own failings, the heavy cloak of guilt, pressed upon him with every passing day, and he found himself trapped in a cycle of self-recrimination that he could neither break nor escape. It was on a rain-soaked evening, when the clouds wept bitter tears upon the barren streets, that fate intervened in the form of an unexpected letter. The envelope, worn and stained by the elements, arrived without warning and carried within it the written words of a stranger. The letter spoke of distant lands and of a lost heritage, of a man whose heart was filled with remorse and longing, a man who had once tried, with all his might, to make amends for the missteps of his past. In that letter, signed with a name that resonated with the echoes of old regrets, there was an invitation to confront the demons that had long haunted the corridors of their lives, and perhaps to find a path back to a semblance of a love that had been so cruelly eroded. Ethan, with trembling hands and a heart heavy with both dread and tentative hope, clung to that letter as if it were a lifeline thrown across a vast and stormy sea. It was a call to reckon with the ghosts of his past, to journey back to the very source of the pain that had defined his existence. And so, driven by a mixture of resignation and a desperate yearning for closure, he resolved to visit the home where his childhood had been both a sanctuary and a prison, a place where the memories of laughter and tears intermingled in a bittersweet dance of regret. The journey back was fraught with the weight of memories. Every step on the cracked pavement of his hometown was a reminder of the days when hope was abundant and the future was a promise yet to be fulfilled. As he approached the familiar house, a structure weathered by time, yet still standing as a silent witness to his early years, he felt the stirrings of emotions he had long tried to bury. The door creaked open with an almost sentient reluctance, as if the house itself mourned the lost innocence of its inhabitants. Inside, the air was thick with dust and memories, and every room held echoes of a life once lived with fervor and unyielding love. Jonathan, now an old man whose eyes carried the weight of unspoken sorrow, sat by the window in a quiet corner of the living room. The soft patter of rain on the roof, the muted sounds of the night outside, and the steady tick of an ancient clock on the wall provided the only accompaniment to his solitude. For a long moment, neither father nor son spoke, a silence heavy with the unspoken words of a lifetime. Then, with a voice that trembled as much from age as from the burden of regret, Jonathan whispered a greeting that seemed to hang in the air like a benediction. It was a sound that carried both the warmth of faded love and the chill of years lost to bitterness. In that fragile, tentative moment, the walls between them, the barriers built over decades of misunderstanding and silent suffering, began to show the first cracks. Ethan, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and trepidation, sat across from his father. The conversation that followed was tentative at first, filled with halting phrases and awkward pauses, as if each word was carefully measured against the risk of reopening old wounds. But as the night wore on, the dam of suppressed emotion began to burst forth. Tears, unbidden and raw, flowed freely down Ethan's face as he recounted the pain of abandonment, the loneliness of growing up in the shadow of a father who had grown cold. Jonathan, in his own quiet way, spoke of his regrets, The heavy cost of a life spent chasing shadows of his former self, the pain of choices made in moments of despair that had cost him the very essence of what it meant to be a father. The dialogue that ensued was not a panacea, nor did it promise an easy road to redemption. It was a painful, cathartic reckoning, a raw, unfiltered confrontation with the past that neither could escape. The echoes of laughter and joy that had once defined their relationship mingled with the bitterness of old wounds, creating a tapestry of emotions so intricate and tumultuous that it defied simple resolution. Yet, in that painful exchange, there flickered a small, fragile light. The possibility that, even in the midst of hatred and despair, there might be a way to rediscover the love that had once bound them together. Days turned into weeks as the two of them navigated the treacherous terrain of their shared history. They took long walks along the riverbank where Ethan had once played as a child and where Jonathan had once shared his dreams of a better future. They spoke in hushed tones of the moments that had defined their lives, of the love that had blossomed and then withered, and of the choices that had driven them apart. Each conversation was a step on a path toward healing, a tentative journey toward reclaiming a bond that had been nearly obliterated by the corrosive forces of time and hurt. Yet, even as they began to confront their pain, the world outside remained indifferent to their personal struggles. Life in the town moved on, a relentless march of seasons, celebrations, and sorrows, while within the walls of that old, creaking house, the slow, painful process of reconciliation played out like a tragic symphony. Neighbors watched from afar, their hearts aching for the two souls whose once radiant love had been marred by so much suffering. And though there were moments of tentative understanding, the scars of years of neglect were not so easily erased. Old wounds, though slowly healing, remained as reminders of the price of unspoken words and unresolved grief. In the end, the journey of father and son was not one of perfect resolution, but of imperfect, human reconciliation, a fragile truce forged in the crucible of shared pain and the desperate need for redemption. There were days when the old bitterness would resurface, when the wounds would throb with the memories of a lifetime spent apart. But there were also days when the silence between them was filled with the quiet warmth of mutual understanding, when the old scars seemed to soften in the light of renewed hope. Now, as I stand here recounting this tale, a tale of love turned to hate, of deep emotional struggles and the arduous journey toward forgiveness, I am reminded of the bittersweet truth that some bonds, no matter how deeply fractured, can never be completely broken. The journey of Jonathan and Ethan is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, to the idea that even when love fades and transforms into something unrecognizable, the echoes of what once was can serve as a guide toward healing. Their story is one of endless complexity, a saga of profound loss and tentative redemption, of hearts burdened by regret and yet still capable of small, flickering hope. And so, dear listener, as you absorb the layers of this long, winding narrative, remember that the path from love to hate is paved with the stones of human frailty, but also that the journey back to forgiveness, however long and treacherous, is a path worth treading. For within each of us lies the capacity to mend even the deepest wounds, to transform the bitter taste of regret into the sweet promise of a new beginning, even if that promise is as fragile as a candle's flame in the darkest of nights.